All right, so now let's get into the dynasty within medieval England that succeeded the very short but impactful dynasty of the Normans and inherited the Kingdom of England for the next over 300 years. This particular dynasty in England became arguably the greatest in the entire United Kingdom of Britain and also just arguably in Europe in general. And this dynasty is known to us in history today as the Plantagenet dynasty. And the Plantagenet dynasty got its name from not from the people who lived during their reign in England, but by later historians who utilized the nickname of one of the forefathers of the Plantagenets, who was probably the most important of their forebears, who was known to us in history today as Geoffrey, the Count of the French County of Anjou, and was called during his lifetime Geoffrey Plantagenet. Geoffrey Plantagenet became the husband of the very last remaining child of the great Norman king Henry I, who was known as the Empress Matilda, and she was the Empress of Germany before she became the husband of Geoffrey Plantagenet. But she was one of the last two remaining vestiges of the Norman dynasty that had a legitimate claim to the throne of England after the death of Henry I, who was again her father. The other one was her cousin, who was known to us in history today as Stephen of Blois, and he ended up eventually becoming the last Norman monarch of England. And so because these two had legitimate claimants to the throne of England, Matilda's, of course, being once again through her father, who was Henry I, and then Stephen of Blois, his claim came from the relation that he had to William the Conqueror through his mother, who was Adela of Normandy. And Adela of Normandy, she was a daughter of William the Conqueror. And so, but this led to a almost 20-year-long conflict known to history as the Anarchy that ensued from about 1138 to 1153. Okay, so but the person who ended up ending this conflict was not the Empress Matilda, and it certainly wasn't the King of England at the time, Stephen of Blois, who was the deciding factor in the curtailing of this destructive time period in England's history. But rather it was the eldest son of the Empress Matilda, whom she had with the very same Geoffrey Plantagenet that I mentioned a little bit ago. Who will be the one that gained enough favor with the barons and the nobles of England. The barons and the nobles of England, they became convinced enough that he should be able to take on the mantle of king after Stephen's death had come to an end, or after Stephen's reign had come to an end. And so he was able to gain enough prestige, the son of Geoffrey Plantagenet, he was able to gain enough prestige in his birthplace of France as well by becoming, upon Geoffrey Plantagenet's death in 1151, Duke of Normandy, the Count of Anjou, as well as the Counts of Maine and Touraine. And he was able to put an end to this conflict and compel even eventually Stephen of Blois to recognize him as the King of England. On October the 25th, 1153, King Stephen of England died, which meant that this son of Geoffrey Plantagenet and the Empress Matilda, who was known to us in history today as Henry II, was now finally able to be officially recognized as the undisputed King of England, and was officially crowned as the King of England on December the 19th, 1154. And this is what started what we know today as the Plantagenet dynasty. But the story of the Plantagenets' ascension to the throne of England, as well as what proceeded afterwards for the next over 300 years, is far more well known than what the origins of this dynasty was and who even came before the father of the first Plantagenet king, Henry II. And so in order for us to understand the origins of the Plantagenets, we have to go back to where they came from and to the people that they descended from. The people who the Plantagenets descended from, they were a group of people that were part of a larger conglomerate of tribes known to history as the Germanic tribes. And this particular tribe of the Germanic tribes, they ended up occupying a region in Europe known as Gaul. And they did this after they had conquered the Gallic peoples in 486. And this particular Germanic tribe will become known to history as the Franks. The Franks, they ended up occupying and ruling over the area at the time, again known as Gaul, which was made up of the countries we know today as Germany, the Netherlands, certain parts of Italy, Luxembourg, Belgium, and the country that would eventually become named after the Franks, which is known to us today as France. And it was these Franks who would end up occupying France and shaping the country that we know as we know it today. They made up the ancestry of the Plantagenets, at least paternally. Now maternally, or from the side of Henry II's mother, the Empress Matilda, the Plantagenets were Norman, and as I've already shown from my previous videos, going all the way back to the revisitation we did of the Vikings and their history and what they looked like in history, the Normans, who were the descendants of the Danish Vikings that migrated to Normandy in 911 AD, were peoples of color. There's not much that needs to be shown that hasn't already been shown and even said from my previous videos on the Normans, so you guys can go and check those out. But we should already know that they were a people of color based off of the evidence I displayed in those videos. And so now let's take a look at and learn a little bit more about the paternal side of the Plantagenets, and also learn a little bit about the Franks and who they were, and most importantly, what they actually looked like in history. So now when it comes to the Franks, as I've already stated, they were a Germanic people, meaning they were a part of the group of people whose earliest attested to origins stem from the northernmost parts of Europe, specifically around the area of the Danish peninsula and or just Scandinavia in general. These Germanic peoples had ensuing conflicts with the Romans from roughly the 2nd century AD to the 5th century AD until the eventual fall of the western portion of the Roman Empire in 476. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into the history of the Germanic peoples in this video, even though they are pretty relevant to the subject of this video, but my full summary of their origins will be reviewed in a far more in-depth video soon, or a far more in-depth series of videos soon to come on this channel pertaining to the Holy Roman Empire, because the Germanic peoples, they were the ancestors of the Holy Roman Empire rulers and emperors. But for now, I'll just say pertaining to the Germanic tribes that they are one of the most lied about group of people pertaining to their physical appearance by modern day scholarship that exists. Modern day translators and historians who transcribe the descriptions that are given about the Germanic peoples either mistranslate what was said about their physical description, or they'll take translations about the ancient Germanic tribes out of their proper context, which has led to people believing, or which has led to the Germans becoming this perfect quote unquote image of the Caucasian with blonde or red hair, pale skin, and blue eyes. But in reality, the Germanic tribes, and more specifically since they are the main subject of this video, the Franks were, believe it or not, a people of color. But let me just show a few examples of this real quick here, as to not be accused of making anything up. And again, I'm not going to go into full depth about the Franks and the Germanic people in general in this video, because they will be for a later date. They will be saved for a later date when I talk about the Holy Roman Empire. But let's just take a brief look at how the Franks and just the Germanic peoples in general depicted themselves and how they were actually described. So let's first take a look at a description that will give us a little bit better of an insight into the appearance of the Frankish peoples. And this description is going to be a citation of a description of the Franks from two medieval ecclesiastical historians and scholars who did not live during the time period of when the Franks first migrated out to occupy France and the other areas within Gaul that made up this province in Europe. But their descriptions of the Franks show how disparate the overall understanding of the translations that describe the Franks was between the medieval time period and our modern day time period, and how modern day translators will try to attribute to all of the Germanic tribes pale skin complexion, fair hair, and light colored eyes. So let's just read this description right here real quick of the Franks, and let's just start at the very top. So the otherness of the Franks have been established in the 10th century. They were barbarians because they lived outside the empire and were therefore not Romans, but they were Christians. They had once formed part of the empire, and they were credited with providing at least one emperor, Constantine the Great, and so were regarded as having a special relationship with the Byzantines. They were characterized by Anna Comnene in her account of the First Crusade, written in the late 1140s, as ambitious, brave, contentious, greedy, hot-headed, uncontrollable, and untrustworthy. They were barbarians because they lived between the further side of the Adriatic and the pillars of Heracles, Nicias, Coniates, and Atheios of Thessalonica. Both echoed this stereotype but stressed appearance and language. So both of these men who describe the Franks, once again, were not born around the same time when the Franks first made their way out to France, but they had records of their appearance as well as first-hand knowledge of what their descendants looked like during the medieval time period. So their description of what the Franks looked like is more than valid. But let's read what this has to say about the account of the Franks' appearance according to these two historians. So they were robust, swarthy, fierce, and quick to anger. Okay, so right there we see that operative term swarthy that I've gone over numerous times on this channel before, and by now at least the people who have been on here should know that swarthy during the medieval time period meant a person of color. Okay, not a tanned skinned Caucasian who became darker due to the sun bearing down on their skin, but it meant a person who was so-called black, or someone of a complexion that could stem from dark brown to a medium brown color. But let's just take a look at some examples of what these Franks looked like as they were depicted, and really how they chose to depict themselves during the medieval time period. All right, so this first portrayal I want to show is one of the semi-historical ancestors of the Franks, known as Pharamond, who is the one, of course, that's seated on the throne, surrounded by everybody in this manuscript. But Pharamond was, according to the anonymous chronicle of the history of the Franks, he was one of the forefathers of the group of Frankish kings that will go on to become known as the Merovingians. Now, again, this man was a quote-unquote legendary or historical figure in Frankish history, meaning he could have been real or he could not have been real, but the Franks believe that he was one of the oldest ancestors of their kings that ruled in what was known as the Merovingian dynasty, which was the first ever royal Frankish dynasty that ruled in primarily France and preceded the dynasty that Charlemagne the Great established, which was the Carolingian dynasty. But again, that will be for another video series for another day. But just looking at this image right here, we can see that Pharamond, again, he is the one that's seated on the throne. He, as well as the other people that are surrounding him, are depicted as peoples of color. But it is of my belief that that this manuscript right here was lightened up a little bit, meaning like the faces were lightened a little bit, because when you look all around him, a lot of the people that surround him and that are crowning him have dark brown skin. Some of them even have light brown skin, but most of them have dark brown skin, helping those who view this image understand that the people who were being depicted in this manuscript image right here are peoples of color, or so-called black people. And these are what the Franks looked like, everybody in this image except for one of the figures I cropped out, because the description of this image does not say they were of Frankish descent, but the figures in this medieval manuscript image are all depicted as peoples of color, because again, the Franks were so-called black people themselves. And this is what was meant by that description I read from earlier pertaining to the Franks being quote-unquote swarthy. These are what quote-unquote swarthy people would have looked like during the medieval time period. Dark to medium brownish in complexion. But I just want to read the description of this image real quick to get the full context of what it is displaying here. So let's just take a look at the description of this image real quick here. Okay, so let's read this description real quick. So, miniature of the coronation of Pharamond, a legendary king of the Franks, with a pagan duke wearing a circlet to the left and two Christian kings of France to the right. And that's referring to the two guys that were standing apart from Pharamond that had the crowns on their heads, but identified by the fleur de lis on their robes. Okay, so this description gives us a little bit more info on what this image is supposed to depict here from this manuscript. And that last sentence is interesting because it lets us know that these two Christian kings off to the side over here that are depicted with faded dark brown complexions were also of Frankish descent, and they were also so-called black men. Okay, so again, the Franks and the kings of France, they were so-called black, and this manuscript helps us understand this. But one of the ways we can tell that some of the people in this image have been altered to a degree is by quickly looking at how some of the other pages in this exact same manuscript depict the Franks and the kings of the Franks falsely as pale-skinned Caucasians. See that from this page right here, which allegedly depicts the first ever king of the Franks to unite all of the Frankish tribes under one rule in France, Clovis I, being baptized in this scene. Obviously, this is completely disparate from how the first page I showed depicted the Franks as a people of color. Okay, and then there's this image right here showing one of the most essential figures of the Fourth Crusade to retake the land of Jerusalem, Peter of Capuia. And in this scene, he is mediating a meeting between one of the later French kings that played a major role in not just France's history, but also in the history of Henry II and one of his sons, who will go on to become the famous Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart, who we'll speak about in the next installment of this series in far greater depth. But just for now, we can see how once again this image differs greatly from the first image I showed, which displayed the Frankish peoples as a brown-skinned so-called black people. And then here is just one last image that depicts the aforementioned king of the Franks, Clovis I, that I showed earlier. And again, there is a clear difference here between this image and the image that more closely depicts Pharamond and the Franks, how they actually look like in history. So, I mean, we should get the point. The other images in this manuscript, which I believe is called the BL Royal Manuscript held at the British Library, obviously have been either painted over or completely fabricated and put inside of a replica of the original manuscript book, and are definitely disparate from the image that properly depicts the Franks as a people of color, which of course this one does right here. But before I move on, I know I'm going to get some people in the comments who say, despite these people clearly being shown as peoples of color, that they have quote unquote European features still, because the hair, for example, on a couple of these figures from this image is either kind of a shade of brownish blonde, and even some of them have reddish type hair color. But once again, for number one, there is a great likelihood that this image has been altered to a degree, just like the other ones in this manuscript have been altered as well. But if this is not the case, what people have to understand is that the medieval Europeans, they would style their hair a lot like how especially so-called blacks style their hair today. They straightened their hair. Later on, they wore wigs, like around the time of Queen Elizabeth I and even Mary, Queen of Scots. The wearing of wigs was very popular, and both of those queens, who were so-called black women, by the way, would also wear wigs that were oftentimes different colors, which is where we get the descriptions of them having light-colored hair from. But in reality, both of their hair colors were dark brown to black in color, but that will be something I'll talk about in later series. But the peoples of medieval Europe, they styled their hair, they straightened it, and even dyed it as well. As a matter of fact, the Germanic peoples, who of course the Franks descended from, made it a habit to dye their hair different colors that were light colors, such as red and blonde, which is why they were described with those hair colors by the ancient Romans. And again, this is something that I'm going to go into much greater depth when I talk about the Germanic tribes and the Holy Roman Empire in general. But just because this is a relevant thing to kind of gloss over real quick here, I'll just show some examples of what I'm talking about and why I make the statements I'm making now, as well as why I said earlier on in this video that scholars, historians, and translators have lied so much about the appearance of the ancient Germanic tribes and about them being fair-skinned and fair-haired Caucasians. So let's first start off by reading this 19th century translation of the very famous account given by the Roman general, and really the man who was supposed to be the first emperor of Rome had he not been assassinated, Julius Caesar, of the wars that Rome perpetuated with the Celtic peoples known as the Gauls. And this is an annotated version of this historical account, which was translated and edited by a very well-known translator and historian during the 19th and 20th century by the name of St. George William Joseph Stock, who was a scholar from the prestigious Oxford University. So let's read his account pertaining to the description of the Germans and what was actually implied by the ancient Roman scholars that stated that the Germans had red or blonde hair, and how that was not their actual hair color, but hair dye that they put in their hair. But let's just read this real quick here. So it seems then we ought not to think of the hair of the ancient Germans as the same light blonde color as that of the modern Swede. So already this highly renowned translator and scholar is putting into context that the hair of the ancient Germanic tribes was not of the same color as the hair of the peoples today who occupy the Scandinavian peninsula, who would be regarded as the most allegedly quote unquote Teutonic looking people on the planet Earth, or Germanic looking people on the planet Earth, because the people who were actually formerly the ancient Germans did not look like the people who we are told are the descendants of these ancient Germanic tribes. But anyway, reading on, he says, but we must remember that the prevailing hue, talking about the hue of their hair, was to a great extent artificial. So this is yet another cue that again the hair of the ancient Germanic tribes was not actually blonde or red like we're told it was in history. It was, as this author is suggesting, greatly artificial, or the result of some sort of ulterior way to make it that particular color. But anyway, reading on, we have seen already that the Gauls take care of their children's locks should conform to the regulation type of ruddy gold, and the Germans imitated their practice in this particular. Pliny informs us that the Gauls invented a soap for turning their hair golden, and this was more used amongst the Germans by the men than by the women. Okay, so here is the payoff of what this translator is trying to get across to the reader, which is that again the Germans as well as the Gauls did not have naturally blonde or gold hair, or red hair at all whatsoever. As he stated, the Gauls created this type of soap that allowed them to change the color of their hair from what it originally was, which was most likely dark in color, to a sort of golden or red or even reddish gold colored hair color. And the Germans, they utilized this same soap to do the same thing to their hair. Okay, and there were various reasons for why they did this. One of them being the reasoning for why they dyed their hair red, which was to imitate the color of blood on the battlefield, to kind of use that as a scare tactic against their enemies. And as for the color gold was looked at as a symbol of royalty and prestige back then during this time period. And so the practice of dyeing one's hair golden was a way to denote that they were a person of royalty or prestige. But either way, the Germans did not have what we would think of today as blonde or red hair. And another way that this can be backed up is just by taking a look at the origin of the word blonde itself and how it was used by the Germans to describe the very color that we know of today as blonde, as it pertained to someone's hair being dyed that color. So here is etymology.com's rendition of the word blonde and its origins. And when we look down to where it gives us the Old English definition of blonde, which, by the way, for those of you who don't know, Old English, or just English in general, is a Germanic language in origin, spoken primarily by the Anglo-Saxons, who were a Germanic people themselves. But anyway, this account of what the origin of blonde was, according to the Germans, states Old English, but blonden meant dyed. So it is also possible that the root meaning of blonde, if it is Germanic, may be dyed, as ancient Teutonic or Germanic warriors were noted for dyeing their hair. So again, we see another instance where the Germans were documented as dyeing their hair color, or dyeing their hair the color of blonde or gold, and not actually having this color as their natural hair color. Okay, the Germanic word for blonde in and of itself quite literally implies someone who dyed their hair to achieve this golden or even golden brown type of color. And just to refer back to the image that caused me to veer off into this spiel, which was the manuscript image of Pharamond in the Franks. Once again, the hair color of light brown / golden brown that is displayed here was a color that was fabricated by the Germans, which would of course include the Franks, which is why the man right here most likely is depicted with this hair color. Again, the Germans and other peoples during the Middle Ages in Europe styled their hair. They did not actually have this type of hair originally, but yet another color I mentioned some of these figures having, and that the Germanic tribes would dye their hair the color of, was red. And I just want to briefly read something that will help us understand that the Germanic tribes would also dye their hair red as well, and that it was not actually naturally red. So now this book was actually written by a German 18th century author and scholar by the name of Johann Beckmann. So this guy can kind of act as a sort of whistleblower pertaining to the real appearance of the Germans and them not being a light-haired people. But anyway, let's read what he has to say about how the Germans achieved the artificial red hair color they gave themselves. So the German soap, which Pliny tells us the Germans colored or dyed their hair red, was imported to Rome for the use of fashionable Roman ladies and their gallants. There is no doubt that the Palais Medicae, which Merito recommends as a preservative of gray hair, the Costa Spuma, with which the Germans dyed their hair, and the Botvian froth or lather which the Romans employed for coloring theirs, were German soap. Okay, so again, the Germans were documented by the contemporary Roman scholars and writers such as Pliny and even Merito as using a kind of soap to dye their hair the color of red. So this should be about all the proof we need for now that the Germanic tribes were not a fair-haired people. And you know what's interesting? There was actually a genetic study that was done a while ago, which not to my surprise wasn't heavily publicized in the media, but can still be found on, I believe, the old ABC scientific website, that states that the Germans had been found genetically to not be a fair-skinned, fair-haired group of people. And even though I have expressed my gripes with this type of research centered around quote-unquote genetic studies in the past, these are the types of genetic studies that are actually valid when they can be backed up by actual real history and not just conjecture by people trying to push a narrative about what a certain group of people look like in history according to what they wanted them to look like. But anyway, I've made my point for now pertaining to the Germans and by osmosis the Franks. and them not being a fair-haired, fair-skinned people like the mainstream likes to lie to people and tell them they were. And I have way more information on this particular topic than what I have presented, but again, that will be for our later series of videos. But just getting back to the Franks, who again were the ancestors of the rulers that will go on to comprise what would become known today as the House of Anjou, and would later become the House of Plantagenet in England, and rule England for the better part of 300 years. These people were so-called black. The Franks were so-called black. And another way we can tell that this is the case is just by looking at some of their coins that they minted during the time of the flourishing of their first established dynasty in Europe, coming off the heels of them thwarting off the rule of the Romans after their fall in 476, which we know of in history today as the Merovingian dynasty. During this dynasty, which lasted from about 481 to 751, there were many coins minted called triens or tremises, and a lot of them survived down to today. And they often, as most forms of coinage do, depicted notable figures in their history or during their time period. Here is one right here. It depicts a Merovingian king, although I am not quite sure which king this is. It nevertheless depicts one of the Frankish Merovingian kings of that dynasty, and he is shown here with some clear negroid features, especially with the lips. You can see that the lips are very pronounced and thick in appearance, which makes it obvious that this was indeed a so-called black man. And then here's another one right here. This is a coin that was said to have been made during the Merovingian era around the early 7th century. And once again, this is clearly a so-called black man on the front of this coin. You can see the thick lips and the flat nose and even the kind of kinky hairstyle. But definitely, this was a so-called black man right here that is being displayed on this coin. Here is yet another Merovingian tremise or coin. It's a little blurry, but you can still see somewhat that this coin depicts a person with negroid features. And so now let me just show a few more coins of some more identifiable Merovingian kings that fully established the Frankish kingdom within Europe, which I believe was one of the first Germanic kingdoms that was established within Europe post the fall of the western portion of the Roman Empire. But let's just take a look at some depictions of these early Merovingian kings. This first depiction is a ringlet that displays the image of probably the first verifiably historical Frankish quote-unquote king that ruled over the Franks as more of their military leader than an actual king, despite him being given the title of a king, which I believe is displayed somewhere on this ring, where he is given the title of Rex, which was Latin for king. But anyway, this man's name was Childeric I, and this is a ringlet that depicts his image. And all you have to do is take a look at this, and you can clearly see that he has negroid features, which by comparison with mainstream depictions of Childeric I, you can clearly see that this is not a so-called Caucasian like conventional historical narrative would have you believe. You can see the two long braids going down the sides of his head. And by the way, the style of having long braids or long hair was something that the Frankish royalty figures would take pride in because it separated them from everybody else amongst the Franks who had their hair kind of like cut short. And so because of this, I believe it was Gregory of Tours, the Gallo-Frankish chronicler, who coined the nickname long-haired kings for the Frankish nobility. But either way, you can clearly see that this is a so-called black man. And when you move down the line a little bit in his lineage, at least a little bit after his son, who was the first official king of the Franks, who established the Frankish Merovingian dynasty in 481 and united all of the Frankish tribes under one rule, who I already mentioned earlier a couple of times. His name was Clovis I. And then when you go from Clovis I to his son, who was known during his time as Childebert I, you can see again that the Merovingian kings were so-called black men. This coin that depicts Childebert I obviously is showing a so-called black man. Just look at the features, you can clearly see it. And so sometime after Childebert I in the Merovingian succession, there came a king by the name of Childebert II, who was a couple of decades removed from Childebert I, and I believe he was the great-grandnephew of Childebert I. But anyway, Childebert II ruled the Frankish kingdoms of Austrasia, which encompassed much of the northwestern portion of France and parts of Germany and Burgundy, which was in France. And this is what his coin looks like right here. a side view image of him that once again shows him to have had quote-unquote negroid features. And then right after Childebert II held the throne of Austrasia and Burgundy until 592, his son Theodebert II took his place and ruled, I believe, just Austrasia from 592 until 612. But here is Theodebert II's coin right here, and again, it is pretty apparent that this was a so-called black man right here. You can see the flat nose and the thick lips. And then moving down some in the line of succession of the Merovingian kings of Austrasia, there was a king who ruled this province for over 30 years, and from about 633 to 656, and he went by the name of Sigebert III. This is his authentic ringlet from his time period, and this is pretty clear as day. You can see the flat nose and thick lips, but then if you look closely, he has 3 very long braids going down his hair. Again, the Merovingian kings, they wore their hair very long, and sometimes the style would be in a braid or dreadlock style like this, and this is how they would wear their hair in a long fashion, not in the way the mainstream would depict their hair being worn in a sort of long, flowing, straight-haired way, like this alleged portrayal of Sigebert III shows him to have looked like, allegedly. This fake, later-made image of Sigebert III looks nothing like the actual, authentically made ringlet that depicts Sigebert III as he would have looked like during his lifetime, since this ring was made during his lifetime. This ringlet was actually made during his lifetime. But this is how Sigebert III looked, and Sigebert III, he would go on to have a son that would go by the name of Dagobert II, and Dagobert II, who was somewhat to a degree an insignificant Merovingian king in this dynasty, only having ruled the province of Austrasia for about 3 or 4 years, he had a daughter that would become a very well-known Christian saint in the Roman Catholic pantheon of saints, and she is known to us today as Saint Adela. Saint Adela, like all other Christian saints, had various depictions made of her, one of the most famous ones being an icon that depicts her, and this is how her icon displays her to have looked. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory, as well as consistent with what we've seen thus far pertaining to the Franks and how they were portrayed as looking like. This is obviously a so-called black woman right here, and we should know that this is most likely what she would have looked like during her lifetime by just referring back to the previous image I showed of her grandfather Sigebert III, clearly being shown as a so-called black man. So this is yet another example of the Franks actually being, as the first description I read of the Franks stated, as a people of color. They were a people of color, or quote-unquote swarthy, okay, or dark brown in complexion. And so just to add on a couple more examples of this assertion that I'm making, just in case people are still skeptical about the ancestors of the Franks being so-called black, or excuse me, the Franks themselves being so-called black, there are even more depictions of Frankish kings who ruled France after the Merovingian dynasty ended in 751 that show them as so-called black, as well as the people who occupied the various places the Frankish people inhabited after they made their way into Western and Eastern Europe. The line of kings that came after the Merovingians will go on to become known to history as the Carolingians, and they were named directly after the ever famous Charles the Great, or better known as Charlemagne. And then, well, after the Carolingian dynasty ended in 987, there was another Frankish dynasty that was established after the Carolingians that became known as the Capetians. And the Capetians, they would set the standard for the rest of the French dynasties that would come after them. Such as the French dynasties of the House of Valois and the House of Bourbon, which were just cadet branches of the Capetians. But I'll explain that all once I get around to talking about the kings of France. But anyway, the first ever official king of the Capetians was a man by the name of Robert II, or Robert the Pious, as he was also known during his lifetime. And he was the son of the establisher of the Capetian royal house, who was known as Hugh Capet. And this is how he was portrayed by one of the more well-known later medieval French artists, Jean Fouquet. Again, and we can see here another instance of a Frankish king who was depicted as a person of color. He has a clear dark brown complexion in this manuscript portrait of him. And then when we just take a look at the areas beyond France and see where the other areas that the Franks migrated to, such as Germany, there are German manuscripts that display the Franks that were in Germany, and we can see that they were still portrayed as people of color. This is a manuscript this is a manuscript right here, which I believe was called the Welsh Chronic manuscript, and it was a German manuscript made during the late 14th century. And again, we can see that the Germanic peoples were in fact a people of color. The scenes in this manuscript are specifically set in the region of Germany known as Bavaria, but all of these scenes show the Bavarians as a so-called black people. Okay, there's nothing much else to say. These people are clearly so-called black. And just to echo the sentiment I made earlier about how the ancient Germanic tribes were not these fair-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, quote-unquote, Aryan-looking people, they were, of course, a people of color. There are other pieces of evidence to back this up, such as the heraldry that a lot of the noble families within the areas of Germany, like Bavaria, showed them to have been a people of color and to have different hair colors as well. One of them in particular shows the phenomenon that existed amongst the Germans I referenced earlier, pertaining to how they dyed their hair, mainly the colors of gold and red. This coat of arms right here from Bavaria shows a so-called black woman with two long braids going down her back, and the braids are gold colored. Again, the Germanic peoples, they dyed their hair different colors like this because it represented something. In the case of gold, it represented regality or royalty, and then red represented, at least to the Germanics that were fighting against the Romans, it represented blood and was used as a tactic to intimidate the Romans or whoever else they would be fighting. But I want to show just one last depiction of two Frankish nobles living within Bavaria who came from the noble families of Maybach, like the Karl Maybach and Grumbach. And these were two highly distinguished Franconian families that resided in Germany for centuries. And they were known during their lifetimes as Philipp von Maybach and Eva von Grumbach. This is a relief that depicts what they looked like while they were alive. And once again, it is very clear, it's clear as day, that these were two so-called black people. And you know what? The coat of arms from the family that the lady in this relief, Eva von Grumbach, belonged to, shows that the Grumbachs as a whole were in fact a people of color, which is why they have a so-called black man representing them in their heraldry. And so now it should be understood that the Franks were a people of color. And so since we know that this is the case, we can now go back to the Plantagenets, or as they were formerly known as the Angevins, due to them having a long history as the Counts of Anjou. And we can surmise that since they descended from the so-called black Germanic Franks, they too had to have been so-called black themselves. The Angevin family traced their ancestry back to a Frankish nobleman who went by the name of Angular, who was the Viscount of the province in France known as Angers. And then from him sprang forth a noble house that was named after him, known as the House of Angular. And Angular himself would have a son who he named Fulk. And Fulk ended up holding many titles of nobility during his lifetime, including the Count of Tours, the Count of Nantes, and would also go on to become the first Count of Anjou, which established the presence of the noble house that later on became known as the Angevins, and then later the Plantagenets within this particular county in France. So Fulk the first of Anjou was an essential figure in getting the later known Plantagenets foot in the door per se, as a house to be reckoned with within the overall grand scheme of things within France. And so that is why it is important to understand who he was and also how he was described during his lifetime, because according to French historical sources, Fulk the first Count of Anjou was given the nickname Le Roux during his lifetime. Now I went over to an extent what this term Le Roux meant when applied to somebody during the medieval time period. Back then, it was customary to give people color epithets or names that indicated a certain physical trait that particular person had, and sometimes even their to describe their character. But most of the time, the color names that would be given to someone were in reference to that person's skin color. Okay, so a name like Le Roux, which was basically the old French way of calling somebody the ruddy, was a word that was meant to help indicate that someone was of a ruddy, which really was a reddish brown skin color, and that is exactly what Le Roux meant. I already showed that this term Le Roux, or simply just the word roux, meant a reddish brown color in the French language in my previous video, when I showed examples from sources such as etymology.com, which stated from roux, red, reddish brown. Okay, so roux in the older form of the French language was a word that was taken to mean a red but really reddish brown type of color, and that's evidenced by its modern day usage to describe a sort of browned butter sauce used in cooking that this definition alludes to as well. The originally intended color for that term roux is maintained when talking about the color of the roux sauce, which looks something like this. As one can see, this is a brown color. Okay, so that is according to etymology.com, but also when we look at some French to English dictionaries, the same definition is maintained. When we look at French to English dictionaries, such as the one that was created by a 19th century lexicographer by the name of John Below, he also states that the word roux was a term meaning reddish brown. And when one also understands that this French term roux was equated to the term roussette, according to the likes of the 1800s French author Auguste Brachet in his etymological dictionary of the French language, and also in this late 1800s dictionary of the English to French languages, roux is once again equated to the term roussette, and the word roussette is a term that means a color that can vary from reddish brown, just like the word that it is equated to, which is roux, to even dark brown in color. Okay, this is according to such dictionaries as the Noah Webster Collegiate Dictionary, which states that roussette means reddish brown, and then also in Samuel Johnson's dictionary, which was made in the late 1700s, you can see that he defines this word to mean reddish brown as well, the term roussette to mean reddish brown as well. And then lastly, the very well-known early 18th century translator Nathan Bailey, who had influence on both Samuel Johnson and Noah Webster's dictionaries, states in his dictionary that the color roussette meant a dark brown color. Okay, so just going back to Fulk the of Anjou, who was given this epithet of roux by presumably contemporaries who knew him and saw him in person, he was given this name because he was a man whose skin color resembled what was meant to be implied by the color roux, which was someone of a reddish brown complexion, or maybe even a dark brown complexion. If roux was used in the same vein in Old French as the word it's equated to in the English, which was of course roussette. But there is no doubt that roux meant reddish brown, and we can see this by looking at even more French to English dictionaries. This one right here, written by a 19th century lexicographer by the name of John Charles Tarver, states that roux means reddish brown. But when you read further, it will tell you that roux also meant someone who had red hair, and then it even mentioned roux it mentioned quote unquote red, but that term red that this definition mentions really meant a reddish brown color or a reddish brown skin color. But like I explained in my last video, oftentimes this is what translators will do when trying to translate something from antiquity. They'll try and translate a word that either had a completely different meaning originally from what they've translated it to mean today, or they'll take one meaning that a word could be defined as, and if there's any wiggle room to include and inject features that are characteristically quote unquote Caucasian into the definition, they'll do that. So that is why in dictionaries such as this one right here, and even others like this French and English translative dictionary written by an English lexicographer by the name of William James, it states that roux again means reddish brown, but then they find a way to inject red hair into the mix, but then also reiterated that the real primary definition of roux is a brown type of color, which is why this states roux means brownish. And then in the short French dictionary that was created by a actual French lexicographer by the name of Guy Miege, it states that roux meant red or ruddy, and then also red-haired. But then it goes on to give the actual or closer to the actual meaning of this term roux, which was a brown color. And then after that it states that it means yellow. And so again, we can see this phenomenon of trying to equate the word or the term roux to someone being red-haired, which is something that a lot of translators and lexicographers were trying to do even way back when this dictionary was created, which was in around the late 1600s, if I'm not mistaken. But what has to be understood, though, is that these color terms like roux, when applied to someone during the medieval time period, were mainly in reference to someone's skin color and not their hair color. This rendering can be seen with the main topic of this segment of the video, Fulk the First Count of Anjou, or Fulk le Roux, who was given that nickname because he was of a reddish brown complexion. Now, there aren't that many extensive historical records from the Middle Ages on Fulk the Red, seeing as though he wasn't anywhere near as impactful as any of his descendants on the overall forward movement of the House of Plantagenet, or as it was formerly known during Fulk's lifetime, the House of Anjou, named after his father. But he did kickstart their overall presence as a noble house within France, and there are some relatively modern day documentations that mention him and shed light on the real reason as to why he was given the name Leroux during his lifetime. This is a scholarly journal known as Notes and Queries, and it has a long-standing history in academia since about the mid to late 1800s. And it's basically, like I said, a scholarly journal that published short articles on subjects like English lexicography and even history. And I believe this particular volume is from the University of Michigan's library, but it was published by the Oxford University Press thereafter. So either way, it is a highly accredited and scholarly source. And under one of the articles in this journal pertaining to the history of the Angevins or Plantagenets, it states that the descendants of Fulk, surnamed from his ruddy complexion, the Red. So we see here that this scholarly journal acknowledges the fact that Fulk the Red, the first Count of Anjou, was called Leroux, or as this English translated journal states, the ruddy, because of his complexion, i.e. his skin color. And since we should already know that Leroux was a word that meant a reddish brown color, based off the numerous examples I just gave of that word roux meaning this particular color right here, it's safe to say that this was the type of skin color Fulk, the first Count of Anjou, had, which would of course make him a man of color or a so-called black man, just like his Frankish ancestors we just saw numerous examples of. But one of the main ways we can confirm this is by taking a look down the line or the lineage of Fulk, the first Count of Anjou, and seeing who else came after him. So Fulk, he had a son. Fulk, the first Count of Anjou, had a son who became known to history as Fulk the second Count of Anjou, and Fulk the second Count of Anjou had a son who became known as Geoffrey the first Count of Anjou from about 960 to 987. And around this time is when the Capetian kings of France, which was a royal house that the Angevins were not even closely just related to, but the Angevins, they were actually known as what was known as a cadet branch of this particular royal house. And they started to come into power as the rulers of France for the next almost 400 years, from about 987 to 328. And their rulers consisted of people such as Robert II of France, who was the first real king of France that stemmed from the Capetian dynasty. And I already showed a depiction of him, but as a so-called black man. But as I mentioned that, I just mentioned them because they will be an essential part of the overall narrative in the Plantagenets' history, especially during the reigns of Henry II through his son John Lackland. But even after them, the Capetians played a very huge part in the overall grand scheme of things in the Plantagenets' history. But anyways, Geoffrey the first Count of Anjou had himself a son who was named Fulk, which made him the third Fulk in the lineage of the Angevins, and he, just like his great-grandfather, had a color epithet attached to him that will help indicate to us what his true physical appearance was. So let's just take a look and see what that was real quick. All right, so let's get an introduction to Fulk the third Count of Anjou to better understand who exactly this essential figure in the Angevin/Plantagenet history was, and also see what the name he was given during his lifetime was, because again, it will help us gain a better understanding about his physical appearance. So let's read this paragraph. So Fulk the third Nerra. Okay, so this is the word right here to look out for. This French word Nerra. But Fulk the third Nerra, 987 to 1040, was the greatest and most successful of the Counts of Anjou. He succeeded at the age of 16 in the year Hugh Capet became king. His influence spread over Maine, Tours, the Vendôme, and Santiago. He pushed Angevin interest into Brittany, winning the Second Battle of Corvaux in 992. Fulk gained Loudun from Aquitaine, and after the capture of Herbert Wakedog, claimed overlordship of Maine. Fulk Nerra defeated Odo II of Blois, his prime rival, at the Battle of Poltavoy in 1016. The castles Fulk Nerra built on the border between Anjou and Blois are the earliest known in the West. He sought to compensate for a violent career by 4 pilgrimages to Jerusalem and public flagellation. He avoided the wider ambitions that undermined the efforts of Otto II of Blois. Okay, we'll just stop right here, but we just got a little bit more information on who this figure Fulk the third Count of Anjou was in history, and the main takeaway from this paragraph that gives an overview of Fulk the Anjou's life is once again the name that was referenced at the very beginning of this paragraph, which was him being mentioned as having this epithet known as Nerra be applied to him during his lifetime. Now, similarly to his ancestor / predecessor of the overlordship of the county of Anjou, Fulk the First, he was given this particular epithet for nothing else other than his complexion or skin color. But let's just prove that real quick here. So let's get this first explanation on why Fulk III, Count of Anjou, was given this nickname Nerra, which again is a French word and is of course the language that Fulk and his contemporaries spoke while he was alive. And so let's see how this very well known, in fact, one of the most prominent English novelists of the 19th century, Charlotte Mary Yonge, identifies this word to mean based off of her understanding of what words from the medieval time period meant, which was a time period that influenced her writings a lot. But anyway, let's read what she has to say here. So his son, Fulk III, was surnamed Nerra, an old form of Le Noir or the Black. And this is important to understand because we'll be examining what this particular word noir or Lenore means in a little bit here. But reading on, the name was derived from his complexion. Okay, so this man, Fulk III Nerra, was once again called this epithet of Nerra, or better known as Lenore, which meant literally the black because of his complexion, i.e. his skin color. But before we move on and get the exact definition of this word Nerra, really noir, let's look at an actual French source that confirms this color epithet actually being applied to Fulk III, Count of Anjou, because of his complexion. Now let's read this French historical chronicle written in the early 1700s and see an actual French historical source confirm that Fulk III, Count of Anjou, was called Nerra or Lenore during his lifetime to indicate his complexion. And just judging by what the term Nerra or Lenore means, which is black, I think we can get an idea of the type of complexion he had. But for now, let's just read this excerpt, which is in French. So of course I'll translate it after I'm done reading. But let's read what this has to say. So Fulk III, Comte d'Anjou, surnommé Nerra à Lenore, à cause de son tient. And we'll just stop right there. But the translation for what that sentence said is Fulk III, Count of Anjou, was surnamed Nerra or Lenore because of his complexion or skin color. Okay, and before I move on, just to clarify, yes, the word complexion in this instance is a word that indicates skin color. You can look up what this French word tient means, and out and out it means skin color when you look it up, or someone's skin complexion. So I just want to make that clear for a lot of naysayers who will try to state that complexion means temperament and all this other stuff, but which actually to a degree it's true. But words like complexion, when used as an adjective to describe someone, usually almost always means that person's skin color or physical appearance. But anyway, we can see here that again by a French source, Fulk III or Fulk Lenore was stated to have been called this particular color name because of his skin color. I alluded just a little bit ago that the term noir or Nerra was a word that in the French language meant and even still means black. So if Fulk was called Lenore or the Black during his lifetime, and that word noir was used to describe his skin complexion or his skin color, I think we can get an understanding of what type of complexion was that he had. But let's just take a look at some definitions of the term noir to corroborate this. So even though a lot of people don't find Wikipedia to be a very reliable source, we'll back what this has to say up with proof from actual French to English dictionaries regarding the definition of this term noir. But let's just see what this Wikipedia definition has to say about what this French word that was applied to Fulk III of Anjou for, again, his skin color means. So at the top we see noir, and then this gives what noir means as an adjective or a descriptive term, and the first definition it gives is black in color, right? So noir, like I believe the very first person I cited from, Charlotte Mary Yonge, stated, Fulk III was called Lenore, which in the English can be translated to the black. So we've already seen this to be true from an earlier source, and we'll continue to see even more that this is true as I pull up the various dictionary definitions from actual French to English dictionaries that define what noir means. But moving down, it says noir meant dark as well. So another allusion to the fact that noir was a black or dark color. Then the third definition says drunk or inebriated, which has nothing to do with folk, so we'll move on from that. And so, but then we skip down to the very final definition, and we can see that it states this term noir means black once again, but it gives an even more visceral and clearer insight into what a person who is referred to as noir would look like, and what ethnic group they would belong to. And it states black, but then it also states of black ethnicity. So someone who is called this term noir according to Wikipedia, which again is not a reliable source, right? So we'll see if this can hold up as I move on further a little bit down the line here. But for the time being, this is very telling in regards to what this term noir means as it applies to somebody, like how it was applied to one of the ancestors of the House of Plantagenet, Fulk the Third, Count of Anjou. Of course, I've already shown that the people he derived from, that Fulk the Third, Count of Anjou derived from, which were the Frankish people, were a people of color. And so for the definition of this term that was once applied to him to describe again his skin complexion or skin color to be what it is, at least according to Wikipedia, which is black, and for it to mean someone of the quote unquote black ethnic group, it would make a whole lot of sense for Fulk the Third to be a person who was a so-called black person. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what it says in the very next line down. It states noir as a noun meant a black person, i.e. a person of color. And then of course hair has to be injected there as well, but we've already established pretty well that noir was a term that was especially to Fulk the Third, Count of Anjou, a term that was in reference to his skin color. But again, we see here that noir was a term that meant a so-called black person or a person of color. But let's see if this definition can still stand when we look into what actual French dictionaries state. So let's read this first definition from a French to English dictionary written by an actual French author by the name of Alexander G. Collot, and see what it says about the definition of noir, to see if Wikipedia's definition, which stated that noir meant a black person or someone of a quote-unquote black ethnicity, i.e. a person of color, can hold up. So now let's read this. So noir, black, a negro. Okay, so just like that, noir is a French word that according to a French author meant a negro, which obviously means a so-called black person. And even when you look at a lot of the other variations of the word noir this dictionary has listed, it states that words like noirad mean a person whose hair and complexion are black. So the excuse of it only meaning black hair wouldn't even apply if this were the case according to this dictionary, because noir means a person with both black hair and complexion. And then it goes on to say a black man or woman, i.e. a person of color or a woman of color or a man of color. Okay, which is pretty much the same definition that was given from the Wikipedia definition. So so far that particular definition we just read from Wikipedia is holding up quite well according to an actual French source. But just going back to the very first definition I read in this dictionary, again it states noir meant black, and in the case of Fulk the Third, it meant a black complexion. So this further confirms that this is in reference to a person of color by stating noir meant a negro, which undoubtedly means a so-called black person. But let's look at a couple more definitions for this term noir. So this is yet another French dictionary written by yet another French scholar by the name of Gabriel Serin. And when we take a look at this definition of noir, once again, we see that noir is defined as a word that means a black, a black or a negro, i.e. a so-called black person. And then even the variant of noirad is defined again to mean a person of black complexion, i.e. a black man or black woman. And then one last dictionary of the French language, which was written this time by an Irish scholar by the name of Thomas Nugent. He maintains that noir once again meant black and a negro, i.e. a so-called black person. So it should be pretty well substantiated to say that that the word noir that was applied to Fulk the Third, Count of Anjou, for again his complexion, was a word that was meant to help identify him as a so-called black man who must have been very dark-skinned, considering the emphasis that is put on how dark this color noir is or was. And even other things such as this coat of arms for the Lenoir family can help us come to the conclusion that this name, when applied to someone, indicated that person was a so-called black person. But this term Lenoir can be equated also to also a Latin term that actually has was the etymological origin for the word negro and its various forms. The word noir, which is once again a French word in Latin, was pronounced as negre, and this can be substantiated when we take a look at a book written by an actual expert on the Angevins and medieval history in general by the name of Geoffrey Anderson, who actually mentions this term noir being equated to the Latin negere in reference to Fulk the III, Count of Anjou. He states in his book Angevin Dynasties of Europe 900 to 1500, Nerra is now always accepted to be some variation of the Latin nero or negere, which is black, and in English Fulk is often called Fulk the Black. So we see here that the term Nerra, which is just an old French form of the word noir, can be equated to the Latin word negere, and I've already gone over this term negere pretty extensively on this channel, but just in case anybody needed any reminders, I'll provide some real quick. So from this Latin to English dictionary written by the lexicographer Nicholas Salmon, he states that negere meant someone of a black or swarthy complexion. And I've already gone over this term swarthy as well and what it meant when it was applied to somebody a number of times. But we should get the implication of what it meant just by virtue of it being used interchangeably with the word black for someone's complexion. So it meant a person of color. And then when we look at a very well-known Latin dictionary written by the English lexicographer by the name of Robert Ainsworth, he states the exact same thing. The term negere meant someone of a black or swarthy complexion. And then here is yet another Latin dictionary, which is just an abridged version of Robert Ainsworth's dictionary, written by a very well-known 18th century English scholar by the name of Thomas Morell. But he states that negere means the exact same thing from Robert Ainsworth's original Latin dictionary, which is a black or swarthy complexion. And then here is one last Latin to English dictionary written by a lexicographer by the name of William Young, and again the same thing can be seen. So we should get pretty much get the point by now. Fulk the Third or Fulk le Noir, i.e. Fulk the Black, was in fact given this epithet of the Black because he was indeed a so-called black man with a black complexion. And one last final thing I'll show on him before we move on to our next person is this supposed depiction of him in a church that was built during the 12th century in the city of Loquis, France. This church was actually built by a son of Fulk the Blacks or Fulk the Thirds. I believe it was his son who was known during his lifetime as Geoffrey, who was Geoffrey the Second, Count of Anjou, as well as Geoffrey Martel or Geoffrey the Hammer, because he was known for his prowess in battle. But anyway, this is a relief of a particular figure that has been alleged to be Fulk the Third of Anjou, and if this is in fact Fulk the Third, it would definitely make sense because this obviously depicts a so-called black man right here. You can see the facial features, especially the thick and prominent lips of this figure. But either way, it should already be understood that Fulk the Third of Anjou was in fact a so-called black man. So now that we have confirmed this as true, let's look further down the line into the Angevin family and inch closer to where we are trying to get to, which are the Plantagenets. So after Fulk III, as I already mentioned, he had a son by the name of Geoffrey, who was the Count of Anjou as well as of Vendôme. He was known also as Geoffrey Martel for his prowess in battle, and even was involved in a couple of battles against William the Conqueror himself. But Geoffrey II of Anjou ended up dying in 1060, and he left no male children to succeed him as the Count of Anjou, and so the title passed down to a couple of his nephews who were related to him through his sister, Ermengarde Blanche, who was married to a French, i.e. Frankish noble by the name of Geoffrey II, Count of Gantones. The first of these nephews of Geoffrey II Martel to succeed him was another Geoffrey, who was the third of his name to become the Count of Anjou. Then after his death in 1096, he was succeeded by his brother, who was named Fulk, and who became the fourth of his name to succeed as the Count of Anjou, which made him Fulk the Fourth of Anjou. And then he had his son, Fulk the Fourth of Anjou had his son. Well, I mean, he had a couple of sons, but this particular son of his followed in the footsteps of his ancestors in succeeding his father as the Count of Anjou, but later on he would take on a much more important and bigger role, and this role that he took on came at the beginning stages in one of the most well-known conflicts in the modern era of history, which sought to recover the land of Jerusalem by the peoples of medieval Europe after it had been conquered by the Islamic Moorish Rashidun Caliphate in 638 CE. The Muslims had held what the medieval Europeans called the Holy Land for over 400 years, years, even after attempts by earlier medieval European rulers like Charlemagne the Great to take it back from them. It wasn't until around the end of the 11th century in 1095 where the medieval Europeans started to become impassioned enough to launch another concerted attempt to take back the Holy Land of Jerusalem from the Islamic caliphates that had dominion over it for hundreds of years. This led to the peoples of medieval Europe making their way again out to the land of Jerusalem, this time in hopes of actually recovering it from the Moorish Islamic invaders. After about 4 years of rigorous battle, the peoples of medieval Europe were able to take back the Holy Land from the Muslims, led by the very first what will become known as King of Jerusalem, Geoffrey de Boleyn. And Geoffrey de Boleyn, he started what will become known as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which lasted for almost 200 years, which was not that long, but within that span of time, many kings and some queens sat on the throne of Jerusalem as its principal rulers. And one of the very first kings to sit on the throne of Jerusalem was none other than Fulk, who became the 5th Count of Anjou, as well as the King of Jerusalem. And it was from this Fulk of Anjou, King of Jerusalem, that the first Plantagenet king, Henry II, would spring forth from by way of his by way of Fulk the 5th Count of Anjou's son, Geoffrey Plantagenet. But before we get to Geoffrey Plantagenet, let's just examine King Fulk of Jerusalem for a minute here. Fulk was described by a near contemporary of his, who was a medieval chronicler by the name of William of Tyre, one of the most well-known medieval chroniclers of that time period. But he described Fulk, the King of Jerusalem's appearance, and in his description of Fulk, he compares him to a particular biblical figure I utilized in my last video to prove that King William II Rufus was a man of color. But for those of you who don't know who I'm referring to, let me just show you who I'm alluding to real quick here. Now let's read this English translation of one of the many medieval chronicles written by the legendary medieval chronicler William of Tyre. And I believe I've stated this already, but I'll just reiterate that William of Tyre, even though he was alive and well during the reign of King Fulk of Jerusalem, he wasn't a chronicler at the time of Fulk's reign, but he was once again alive and aware of his reign. I believe by the time Fulk died, William was no younger than 13, so he is technically a contemporary source, even though he did not see Fulk himself in person. But there is no doubt that even if he didn't see him in person, he received descriptions of him by people who did see him while he was alive. But anyway, let's take a look at how William of Tyre described Fulk and how he looked, and most importantly, what biblical figure he compares Fulk's appearance to. So starting at the top. When Baldwin de Bourg, the second Latin king of Jerusalem, was called from this world, he was succeeded by his son-in-law Fulk, Count of Touraine, Maine, and Anjou, to whom, as we mentioned above, he had given his eldest daughter Melisende in marriage. This Fulk was a ruddy man like David, whom the Lord found after his own heart. So now we can see that William of Tyre described Fulk the 5th of Anjou and King of Jerusalem as a man who was ruddy like David. I've already gone over in my last video to a great extent the description of David and what the meaning of this term ruddy actually was according to both ancient and medieval sources. In the Latin language, ruddy was translated as Rufus, and in the ancient Hebrew language, it was translated as admani. Both of these words are rendered in our modern day English to mean red or rosy colored, i.e. having a pale complexion or a pale skin complexion with red undertones usually seen in the cheeks of the individual that it is describing. Usually you will find depictions such as this of a man or even a woman with a pale complexion and red undertones to their skin, and modern day translators will make this out to be what ruddy means, as opposed to what it meant during the medieval time period, antiquity, and even the ancient world. So even though, like I said, I've gone through an extensive explanation on this term ruddy and what it meant in my last video, for the sake of getting this man, Fulk the 5th Count of King of Jerusalem and 5th Count of Anjou's description correct, because it is very essential to understand what he actually looked like during history, since he is the grandfather of the man who kicked off the dynasty we are about to learn about in great detail over the course of the next several videos, Henry II. So let's go about seeing why King David was described as quote-unquote ruddy in the scriptures to gain an even better understanding as to why Fulk the 5th of Anjou was so directly compared to David by a very close source during his lifetime. So now let's read this first description of David from a biblical academic journal created in the late 1800s by a Scottish theologian by the name of John Hastings. And what this will give us is an insight into how David was described, first by ancient Hebraic sources and what the word that has been rendered to our modern day ruddy and what the word ruddy itself meant to the ancients in general. So now let's read this and see what it says real quick. So David was ruddy and withal of beautiful countenance and goodly to look upon, or goodly to look to. And of course, that was a citation of 1 Samuel 16 and 12. For those of you who didn't know, but reading on, let's just skip down where it says, I cannot feel much doubt. So I cannot feel much doubt in preferring both two and two Clostermans. They were ruddy in body. David too was ruddy, reddish brown in body. All right. So this article renders the Hebrew word that was used to describe David as ruddy to mean him actually being of a reddish brown color rather than the usual explanation that is given about what ruddy means, which is something that is red. The term ruddy or red during the ancient world, again, meant something totally different back then than it does to us today. But let's just take a look at what the exact Hebrew word that was used to describe David was to gain a better understanding of this. So let's read this book written by a very highly renowned Christian scholar in England by the name of Joan E. Taylor so that we can see what the exact Hebrew word was that was used to describe King David and his skin complexion, since I was able to translate what the last source I cited from stated. So notwithstanding this correction, when Jesse's youngest son David is fetched from the fields, it is noted that David is ruddy, admani, literally reddish in skin coloration. And that last point is important to highlight because so many modern scholars try to assert that David was called ruddy due to his hair color being red, but as this states, in all actuality, the term ruddy or admani, the Hebrew word for ruddy, was a word that was in reference to someone's skin color, okay? That is something that will be important to remember even when we start looking into Henry II, because he too, like his grandfather, the one that we're talking about right now, Fulk the Fifth of Anjou and the King of Jerusalem, was compared to David by contemporary sources during his lifetime. But he oftentimes has his description, in my opinion, purposefully mistranslated to imply that his hair was red like David. But just to keep in mind that King David was described as a man of ruddy complexion, which meant his skin color, okay? But now that we have the exact Hebrew word for ruddy, which again was admani, let's go about seeing what this term admani means real quick here. All right, so now let's see what this Hebrew term for the word for ruddy, admani, meant. And this is coming from an actual Jewish encyclopedia written around the late 1800s into the early 1900s. So what is an actual Hebraic source that will give us an understanding of how the ancient Hebrews themselves ultimately defined this word ruddy to mean, which again is far different from how we define that term ruddy to mean today, and was also a word, also that term ruddy was a term that was used to describe somebody's skin color. Okay, remember that. So let's read this real quick. Starting where it says red is expressed by Adam. So red is expressed by Adam, a term probably connected with dam, blood, and this understanding of this Hebrew word Adam, meaning red, and really even meaning ruddy as well, will be essential to keep in mind for the next couple of sources I'm about to show. But reading on, it says, well, let's just skip down to where it says the adjective. So the adjective admani describes a reddish brown complexion, i.e. skin color. And then it cites the exact same verse I read from in 1 Samuel 16 and 12. But again, we see that David's skin complexion is described as being reddish brown in color, right? And just for reference as to what this type of color would, skin color would look like, we can take a glance at an animal that was described in a very similar fashion in the scriptures. I believe it is in Numbers, the 9th chapter, where this particular animal is mentioned. It is known today as the quote-unquote red heifer, but during the ancient world, it would have been called the admani or ruddy heifer. Just from this picture right here, though, we can clearly see that this animal is not really just purely red. I mean, there are red undertones to its skin or its fur, if you want to call it that, but for the most part, this animal has a mainly brown complexion to it, and this is what a reddish brown complexion on a person would look like, which can be substantiated by pictures such as this. These right here are two obviously so-called black boys, and they have the same exact skin complexion or skin color as the color of the quote-unquote red heifer I just showed. So this is without a doubt what David himself would have looked like too, being a man of reddish brown or ruddy complexion. And so going back to the main subject of this segment of this video, who of course is Fulk, the king of Jerusalem, and how he was compared to David in appearance by a contemporary account in William of Tyre, for him to have been likened unto David because, like David, he was ruddy. And knowing what we've gone over thus far about this term ruddy, it can be surmised that Fulk, the fifth count of Anjou, was also of this same skin color, which would undoubtedly, like all of his predecessors and ancestors as a whole, make him a man of color or a so-called black man. But let's just understand something real quick here about the man who described him, William of Tyre. William of Tyre did not write in the Hebrew language, despite him being from an area in and around Palestine and Tyre. But William of Tyre, he actually wrote in the Latin language. And as I went over in my last video, the Latin word for ruddy was Rufus. And if you want an even more in-depth breakdown on this term Rufus, you should check out that video real quick. But let's just quickly go over what this term Rufus meant, which will ultimately give us a great idea of what William of Tyre meant when he was describing Fulk the Fifth of Jerusalem. So now let's get this translation of the term Rufus, which of course was the Latin version of ruddy and was the term that was used to describe both King David and Fulk the fifth count of Anjou, or King of Jerusalem. And this is coming from a scholarly work out of the institution of John Hopkins University. So let's read what this has to say about how the Latin term Rufus had been translated from the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible. So the Vulgate translates the description of David in 1 Samuel 16 and 12, Arat atum Rufus et posher aspectu decore fese, but the Hebrew word Rufus, rendered Rufus means brownish. So now obviously that Hebrew word that this book is referencing was the aforementioned admani, which in the Hebrew language meant ruddy. But the fact that admani was rendered Rufus in the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible means that this term Rufus had to have had a similar, if not identical, meaning to admani. That meaning, of course, being reddish brown, or as this excerpt states, brownish in complexion. But let's read something else to confirm this. So now let's read this excerpt right here to confirm that the Latin term Rufus was, which was translated from the original Hebrew term admani, meant the same exact thing as admani, which was of course reddish brown, or being of a brownish complexion. So let's read this real quick. So Michaelis admitted in his notes that admani might denote a yellowish brown color. Luther rendered brownish, and this is alluding to the Protestant reformer Martin Luther and his translation for David's physical appearance in one of the earlier Bibles that he translated. But I just want to highlight this because I will reference it again in a little bit here. But the Orthodox Lutheran theologian C.F. Keel has the correct translation. He, David, was brownish and with all of beautiful eyes and goodly to look upon. Although in the next line he gives the interpretation red-haired. And that's just an example right there of what I've alluded to in the past, and I've kind of alluded to in this video, which is how the Caucasian will try to take a word that originally meant somebody's skin color, or originally denoted somebody's skin color, and they'll try to instead make it a hair color thing. But in actuality, the word was meant to denote someone's skin color or their complexion. But now let's just read on a little bit further. This explanation is based on the translation given in the Latin Bible, and then it goes on to give the Latin description of King David. But we can clearly see that the English translation given by this Orthodox Lutheran theologian who mentioned the Latin Vulgate version of David's physical description renders the term Rufus as a word that meant, just like its Hebrew counterpart admani, a brown color. So this term Rufus, when applied to someone, meant they were brownish. And again, just going back to Fulk of Anjou, him being described in the exact same way as David would have to mean that he too was a man of brownish or reddish brownish complexion, right? Making him a man of color, just like King David was described to have been. And this can even further be substantiated when we take a look at later versions of the Bible that use the Latin Vulgate, that heavily use the Latin Vulgate as a primary source of translation. They too rendered the term Rufus as brown. Okay, versions of the Bible such as Martin Luther's German Bible, which heavily used the Latin Vulgate for its translation, according to the German professor of modern history at Stuttgart University, Robert Jute, in his book the Jewish Body, he states Richard Wagner's son-in-law, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, chided Martin Luther for describing David as brownish in his translation of the Bible. And get this, though Luther may have meant reddish brown. So we see here that according to Martin Luther in his Bible, which again relied heavily upon the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible, he renders what would be the word Rufus to mean brownish. And just as an aside, this author also mentions how there was a man by the name of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who was a British philosopher of the mid to late 1800s into the 1900s, who tried to chastise Martin Luther for his translation. And the reason for this was because he thought that David was of quote-unquote Indo-Germanic descent, and that he should therefore be identified in the Bible and biblical translations as a man who had blonde hair. I should add that this man, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, was part of a movement during the 1800s going into the 1900s known as the scientific racism movement. And so this is what a lot of these scholars during the 1800s were doing with the translations of historical figures or entire groups of people like the Germanic tribes, and how they are described in translations that were fabricated by translators during this time period. They were taking a lot of the terms that were meant to describe a historical figure, such as the word ruddy or Rufus, and even words like the Greek xanthos and flavus. And what they did was they took the most so-called Caucasian-leaning definition of those words that would depict a historical figure in history, how they would want to depict them, which was as a more often than not, a pale-skinned, blonde or red-haired and blue-eyed Caucasian person. And so this is where you get depictions of figures like King David being so-called Caucasian with red hair or yellow hair and pale skin, and even the Germanic tribes I referenced at the beginning of this video. Remember, I showed that the Germanic tribe or the Germanic peoples were not described having natural blonde and red hair, but rather they dyed their hair that color, oftentimes for symbolic reasons and even as a way to style their hair. But the translators starting in the mid to late 1800s started to translate their descriptions to try and make people believe that the Germanic tribes were pale-skinned, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed Caucasians, when in reality, that is not how they were described at all. And once again, this is something that was even done to the grandson of the main segment of this video, Henry II of England. Scholars purposefully mistranslated his description that was given by contemporary chroniclers like Peter of Blois, that similarly compared the description of Henry II to his grandfather Fulk of Jerusalem. But what modern day scholars have done is they've taken Henry's comparison in appearance to King David, and they've tried to change it into what this racist British philosopher tried to change it to, which was a description that was describing Henry's hair color. And this is where you get the false belief that Henry II was a pale-skinned, red-haired Caucasian man, like he's depicted right here, and so many of these fake manuscripts that allegedly portray his likeness to have been. This same thing has been done to Henry II's father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, which is why he is depicted looking like this oftentimes. And anytime there is a documentary made that describes the origins of the Plantagenets, they will almost always show this image of Geoffrey Plantagenet whenever he is mentioned. And this image, of course, depicts Geoffrey as a pale-skinned Caucasian man with red hair. And when you look up a lot of the fake descriptions of Geoffrey Plantagenet, like the one on Wikipedia, for example, it will tell you that Geoffrey did indeed have red hair and was allegedly anciently described as such. And just like his father, Fulk V, he was actually described as a man of ruddy or really reddish brown complexion. And before I move on to Geoffrey, who will be the last person I mention in this video, I just want to show a couple of translations from the two English Bibles that heavily relied upon the Latin Vulgate, as well as for their rendition of the Bible as its translation, or for their translation, to prove even further that Rufus was in fact a word that meant, in and around the medieval time period, someone who was reddish brown in complexion or brownish in complexion. So I'll show that real quick, and then we'll move on to the final point I want to make in this video. So now we've reached the final historical figure in our investigation into the origins of the dynasty in medieval English history, known as the Plantagenets. This figure was, as I've already pretty much referenced all throughout this video, he was the father of Henry II, the man who, of course, established the Plantagenets, or as they were formerly known, the Angevins, as a royal dynasty within medieval England. And he did this from about the mid to late 12th century or 1100s in 1154 when he ascended to the throne. And this dynasty, it lasted up until 1485 with the infamous king known to history as Richard III as its last sovereign, as this dynasty's last sovereign. So in order for us to get an idea of how Henry II looked, at least before we get into a more in-depth description of him, in the next video that I put out, it is essential to establish that his father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, what he looked like in history, because as I stated earlier, this right here, this is not what this man looked like at all whatsoever. I referenced just a little bit ago that Geoffrey, like his son Henry, has been mistakenly attributed with having red hair. A lot of the more racially motivated scholars and translators, starting around the 1800s, tried to twist and turn words around to fit the narrative of what they wanted to be true regarding certain historical figures. If you guys have been paying close attention, I've carefully referenced and been debunking a lot of these claims, starting with the notion of the ancient Germanic tribes being red/blonde-haired people, and how that was a lie and taken completely out of context by historians, which in my opinion was done so on purpose. And then I lightly referenced the color roux, attempting to be translated as an adjective for hair, but was actually a word that meant reddish-brown in complexion. And this was the case for the first Angevin count I mentioned earlier, which was Fulk the first Count of Anjou. He was a man of reddish brown complexion. And then even with King David, and now he was said to be by the scientifically racist British philosopher Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who tried to state that David was blonde haired by rendering admani to somehow mean blonde for some reason. So these so-called scholars and historians, all of them have had a heavy hand in trying to change the narrative about history and the most important historical figures in history as well. One of those figures being Geoffrey Plantagenet, who, as I've already shown, has been shown in such a fashion as this. As a so-called Caucasian man with red hair and a red beard and a pale complexion. And even the false descriptions that are given of him also describes him as having red hair, such as this one right here. But just as David has had his image purposefully mistranslated to spread disinformation about him having red or blonde hair, so it is with Geoffrey Plantagenet. But also just as Geoffrey Plantagenet's father, Fulk the fifth Count of Anjou and King of Jerusalem, was described as being of a ruddy complexion like David, and with the understanding that we have now of what that term ruddy meant, which was having a brownish or reddish-brownish complexion, so it was with Geoffrey Plantagenet. There are a few proper descriptions I found of him by relatively modern scholars who chose to tell the truth regarding what Geoffrey Plantagenet actually looked like. Here is one right here. This is a book written by an 1800s British writer and art critic by the name of Theodore Andrea Cook, who studied in Wadham University in Oxford and was an avid historical writer on particularly English history. And he says Geoffrey Plantagenet, who took his name from the golden broom that brightens the wide fields of Maine and Anjou, was of a fair and ruddy countenance, lit up by the lightning glance of brilliant eyes. And that was, I believe, an actual contemporary to Geoffrey Plantagenet that this person cited from, that little quote right there. But we can see there that the true translation for Geoffrey Plantagenet was that he was a man of ruddy complexion, i.e. reddish brown complexion, right? And then here is one last person who was a writer by the name of Raymond Deloy Jameson, who actually gives us a little bit of an insight into Henry and how he was described. The author says this in his book, Trails of the Troubadours, about Henry and his father Geoffrey. One day, Geoffrey of Anjou, clad in light armor, rode through the gate of Paris. Behind him, with many knights, rode his son Henry, a lad of 17. They came to do homage for the county of Anjou and to see whether some plot might be arranged against his cousin by marriage, King Stephen of England. These Angevins were likely men, as the Angevins still are, not tall, but ruddy, worldly, and active. All right, so there we have it. Once again, Geoffrey Plantagenet, like his father and later on his son, was described as a man of ruddy or reddish-brown complexion, not a pale-faced Caucasian man with red hair. And he, like his father, Fulk the king of Jerusalem, who was compared to David, was a man of color. And so from him, we have finally come to the great Henry II of England, or Henry Curtmantle, as he was also known as the very first ruler of the Plantagenet dynasty. And he inherited the crown on December the 19th, 1154, after the death of King Stephen of Blois on October the 25th, 1154. And it is from the beginning of his reign where we'll start and examine the Plantagenet dynasty until its end in 1485.